The gun pressed cold against the back of Amelia Zane's neck, and she did not flinch. That was the thing Deputy Harrison Daly could never quite understand about her. The absolute stillness she possessed in moments when every other human being on God's green earth would have crumbled. He stood 10 feet away in the doorway of the Redemption Creek jailhouse, his own revolver drawn, his heart hammering so loud he was certain the outlaw holding her could hear it. The orange light of a dying sunset poured through the single barred window and laid itself across the floor in long, bleeding stripes. "Let her go, Crane," Harrison said, and his voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. The man called Crane, a wiry, hollow-eyed drifter with a warrant outstanding in 3 territories, pressed his forearm harder against Amelia's throat and dragged her another step backward toward the rear door. "You drop that iron, deputy, or I paint this woman across your nice, clean wall." Amelia's eyes found Harrison's, brown and deep and utterly calm. And then she said it. She just opened her mouth and said the words that would tunnel into Harrison's chest and live there like splinters for months. "Let him go, Harrison. I am not worth protecting." The silence that followed was so complete that Harrison could hear the wind pushing a loose shutter somewhere down Main Street, could hear his own blood. He looked at her, really looked at her. The bruise already forming at her jaw from where Crane had struck her when she tried to warn the clerk. The torn sleeve of her plain cotton dress. The absolute certainty in her expression, as if she were stating a simple, established fact of mathematics. "That," Harrison said, adjusting his aim so the front sight of his Colt sat perfectly level with the narrow space between Crane's ear and Amelia's temple, "is the silliest thing I ever heard." He fired before Crane could process the words. The shot clipped Crane's revolver hand clean, sent the gun spinning and skittering across the plank floor. Crane howled and released her in the same instant, and Amelia dropped, fast and deliberate, straight down to the ground the way a person drops when they already know the shot is coming, which meant she had trusted him even while telling him not to. Harrison crossed the room in 4 strides. He kicked Crane's weapon under the heavy oak desk, got the man's wrists wrenched behind him with one hand, and only then allowed himself to look down at Amelia, who was already rising from the floor with that same unbearable composure. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "You are bleeding." "A little. Sit down." "I do not need to sit down, Amelia." She sat down. And that was how it had been between them for the better part of 3 months, since the day she had arrived in Redemption Creek on the southbound stage from Santa Fe, and Harrison Daly had been standing right there in the street when she stepped off it, and everything in his carefully constructed, orderly life had shifted 2 inches to the left and refused to shift back. The year was 1883. And the town of Redemption Creek sat at the edge of the high desert of New Mexico territory, pressed between red bluffs on one side and a thread-like river on the other that only ran with any conviction in spring. It was a town that had been built on the premise of second chances. The name itself said so, and it drew the kind of people who needed them. Ranchers whose spreads had failed in other places, former soldiers whose wars had left them restless, merchants chasing railhead money, and occasionally, a woman traveling alone with one carpetbag and no explanation for where she had come from or why. Harrison Daly was 28 years old that autumn, tall and lean in the way of men who work more than they eat, with dark hair that wanted cutting and gray eyes that people frequently mistook for unfriendly, until they actually spoke with him. He had been deputy to Sheriff Earl Combs for 3 years, and he was good at the work, patient in ways the sheriff was not, observant in ways that had saved more than one situation from turning catastrophic. He had grown up in Cimarron County, the middle child of a dry goods merchant who valued honesty above every other human quality, and that value had settled into Harrison like iron ore settles into stone. He was not flashy. He was not easy with compliments or small talk. But he was, in the bone-deep way of men who have decided what they stand for, absolutely and immovably reliable. He had not expected her. Nobody expected Amelia Zane. She had come to Redemption Creek with the intention of setting up a small school. The town had children and no schoolteacher, and she had a letter from the Territorial Education Office authorizing her to establish one. She presented the letter to Mayor Alcott the same afternoon she arrived, and by the following morning she had arranged to rent the unused building that had briefly been an assay office before the silver surveys came back disappointing. Harrison had helped her move a desk. It was not a romantic beginning. She had come into the general store where he was resupplying the jailhouse coffee tin, and she had asked the proprietor, Mr. Hennessy, if there was anyone who might assist her in transporting a donated schoolroom desk from the storage shed behind the church to the former assay office 2 blocks north. Harrison had been standing right there. He had offered. The desk was heavy, and the street was unpaved and uneven, and it took them 20 minutes to maneuver it through the narrow door of the assay office. By the end of it, they were both dusty and slightly out of breath, and Amelia had said, "Thank you, that was very kind," in the politely dismissive way of someone who does not expect the conversation to extend further. Harrison had nodded and walked back to the jailhouse. But he had thought about her for the rest of the day and the day after that, and he had not been able to entirely say why. It was not only that she was beautiful, though she was, in a quiet, serious way that had nothing to do with performance. Dark hair pinned back at the neck, fine features, hands that were ink-stained from her work. It was something in her manner. The way she looked at everything with complete attention, as if each thing deserved to be genuinely considered before she formed an opinion of it. The way she never filled silence with meaningless words, just to prove she was comfortable in the company of others. The way she held herself, not proudly, not stiffly, but with a kind of self-containment that suggested she had, a long time ago, made peace with being entirely responsible for herself, and had found it a reliable arrangement. He had been drawn to her, the way one is drawn to a fire in a cold room, not by any decision, but by simple gravitational fact. In the weeks that followed her arrival, their paths crossed with the frequency that comes naturally in a town of 340 souls where the same 6 buildings serve most purposes. He bought coffee at the general store on Wednesdays. She bought chalk and writing paper on Wednesdays. He ate supper most evenings at the Redemption Creek eating house on the north side of the main street. She ate there perhaps twice a week, always alone, always with a book open beside her plate, though she never seemed to read it when other people were near. He had begun, without entirely deciding to, sitting at a table near hers, not at her table. He was not forward in that way, and there was something in her bearing that made forward approaches feel like trespassing. But nearby. And occasionally their eyes would meet when she looked up from her book, and she would give him a small, precise nod of acknowledgement. Not unfriendly, exactly, but not an invitation either. The first real conversation happened in October, a month after her arrival, during the kind of warm evening that New Mexico Territory specializes in before winter shuts everything down hard. He had been sitting on the bench outside the jailhouse after finishing a patrol, watching the stars appear over the bluffs, when she walked past on her way back from the schoolhouse. She stopped when she saw him, which surprised him. "Deputy Daly," she said. "Miss Zane," he said, and rose, because his mother had raised him with manners. She looked at the open desert stretching south beyond the town's edge, where the darkness was absolute and enormous. "It is very quiet out there," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite observation and not quite longing and not quite fear. "Mostly," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you like this work, being a deputy?" He considered the question honestly, because it seemed like the right response to her directness. "Some of it," he said. "I like that it matters. I do not always like what it requires." She nodded as if he had confirmed something she already knew about him. "Good night, deputy," she said and walked on, but the next evening she stopped again. And the evening after that. And by the fourth evening, it had become a thing they were doing. This 10-minute exchange in the cooling dark outside the jailhouse. And Harrison had understood with quiet certainty that something was happening between them that went beyond coincidence or convenience. He learned things about her in fragments, the way you learn the shape of a landscape in fog, one outline at a time. She had grown up in Missouri, in a town called Callaway. She had been educated at a women's college in St. Louis, which was unusual enough in 1883 to mark her as exceptional. She had been a teacher previously in a different town, though she did not name the town. She had come to New Mexico territory, she said simply, because she wanted somewhere new. He noticed that she never mentioned family. He noticed that she flinched, very slightly and very briefly, at the sound of raised voices. Not his, not in any dangerous context, but once when two ranchers were arguing outside the general store, a flinch so quick and controlled he almost missed it. He noticed that she kept her curtains drawn in the evenings, and that she always knew where the exits were in any room she entered, and that she was precisely, carefully alert in a way that was not natural alertness but practiced vigilance. He did not ask. He figured she would tell him, or she would not, and that either way she had her reasons, and that her reasons deserved respect. What he did not yet understand was how deep the wound went, or where it had come from, or how thoroughly she had convinced herself that it was permanent. The real trouble began in the second week of November, when a man rode into Redemption Creek on a dun-colored horse and took a room at the Frontier Hotel. Harrison noticed him the way he noticed every newcomer, not with suspicion exactly, but with the professional habit of cataloging details. The man was perhaps 40, lean and weathered, with a mustache going gray at the corners and the particular kind of stillness that Harrison associated with men who had spent significant time being dangerous. He gave his name at the hotel as Mr. Vincent. He said he was passing through. He paid in advance for 3 nights. He also walked past the schoolhouse twice on the first day and once on the second, and he did not look at the schoolhouse when he did it. Harrison filed that away and watched. On the second evening, he was on his bench outside the jailhouse when Amelia came up the street from the schoolhouse and stopped her usual few feet away, and he saw it the moment she rounded the corner, the slight change in her posture, the fractional tightening around her eyes. She had seen the man, or the man had seen her. "Amelia," he said, using her given name for only the second time. "What is wrong?" She looked at him, and for a single unguarded instant the composure slipped. He saw something underneath it that looked like terror. Then it closed back over like water over a stone. "Nothing," she said. "I am tired." "You do not look tired. You look frightened." "Good night, Harrison," she said, using his given name back, which she had never done before, and walked quickly to the rooming house where she kept a room. He sat for a while longer, thinking. Then he went inside and pulled the stack of outstanding warrants he kept filed in the desk drawer, and he read through every one of them. He found nothing under Vincent. He wrote to the marshal's office in Santa Fe. The following afternoon, Amelia came into the jailhouse for the first time. She came during the midday hour when the sheriff usually went home to eat, which meant she had timed it deliberately, which meant she wanted to speak to Harrison alone. She stood in the doorway for a moment, as if making a final calculation about trust, and then she came in and sat down in the wooden chair across from his desk. "There is a man in town," she said. "I know," Harrison said. "Calls himself Vincent, arrived 2 days ago." She looked at him with something that might, in another woman, have been relief. "His name is not Vincent. His name is Warren Doyle. He was, the husband of my older sister, Clara." Harrison waited, keeping his face neutral and open. "My sister Clara died 4 years ago," Amelia said, and she said it the way a person says something they have rehearsed until the saying of it cannot hurt them anymore. "In Callaway, Missouri. The coroner ruled it an accident, a fall down the stairs." She paused. "It was not an accident." Harrison's jaw tightened. He said nothing. "I was there," she said. "I was staying with Clara for the winter. I was the one who—" She stopped, began again. "I testified at the inquest. I told the coroner what I had seen. Warren Doyle's family had influence in Callaway. His father was on the town council. The ruling came back as an accident within a week." She looked down at her hands. "Warren Doyle sent word to me afterward, through his brother, that I should leave Callaway, and that if I ever spoke of it again, to anyone, he would make sure I deeply regretted it." "And you left," Harrison said. "I left. I taught in Kansas for 2 years. Then I heard he had been asking about me, asking in the towns near where I was, asking people whether they knew me where I was living. So I moved again, and again after that." She looked up at him, and her expression was absolutely direct, stripped of the careful neutrality she usually wore. "I have been moving for 4 years, Harrison. I chose New Mexico territory because it seemed far enough. I chose Redemption Creek because it was small enough that a stranger would be noticed." A faint, bleak quality entered her voice. "I thought I had finally put enough distance between us." "But he found you," Harrison said. "He found me," she agreed. "He always finds me." Harrison leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "What does he want?" "To ensure my silence permanently," she said, and the flatness with which she said it was almost worse than if she had said it with fear. Harrison thought about the warrants, about jurisdiction, about the reach of what had happened in Callaway versus what he could act on here in Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory. He thought about the law, which was frequently and infuriatingly inadequate. "I can watch him," Harrison said. "I can make it clear to him that he is being watched. I can ensure that any threat he makes is—" "Harrison," she said, and the way she said his name stopped him. "I have had people offer to help me before, a deputy in Dodge City, a town marshal in Amarillo. Each time, Warren Doyle simply waited until they had other concerns, and then he found another way to come at me. And each time it was someone else who paid the price for being associated with me." She straightened in the chair, and the composure came back fully, like a wall being rebuilt brick by brick. "I am telling you because I do not want you to be caught by surprise if something happens. I am not telling you because I expect you to intervene. You have a town to protect and a job to do." "I am not." She paused, and something crossed her face that was very old and very painful. "I am not worth the complication." "Amelia," Harrison said. "I will likely leave at the end of the week," she continued, as if he had not spoken. "I am sorry about the school. The children deserve better continuity, but I cannot, Amelia." His voice was firmer now, and she stopped. He looked at her steadily across the desk. "What you just said, that you are not worth the complication, that is not a conclusion I am willing to accept." She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read, something between genuine confusion and a kind of wounded longing, as if he had said something in a language she had given up believing existed. "This is not about whether you are worth it," he said. "Whatever he did to your sister, whatever he has been doing to you, threatening you, chasing you across territories for 4 years to keep you silent, that is a crime. Several crimes. And a crime committed in my town is my concern. That is simply how it is. You cannot charge a man in New Mexico for a death in Missouri," she said. "No," Harrison agreed. "But I can charge a man in New Mexico for threatening a woman in New Mexico, and I can wire the marshal's office in Santa Fe. And I can make his life in this town uncomfortable enough that he understands whatever he came here to do is not going to be possible." She was quiet for a long moment. He could see the conflict in her, the deep-rooted wariness fighting against something else, something that wanted very badly to believe him. "Why?" she asked finally, and her voice was quieter than it had been. "Because it is right," he said, and then, after a beat, more honestly, "and because I do not want you to leave." The silence that followed had a completely different quality from the ones before it. Something warm moved through it, tentative and bright, and Amelia Zane looked at Harrison daily with those deep brown eyes, and for the first time since he had known her, she looked entirely uncertain. "You should want me to leave," she said softly. "I bring trouble wherever I go." "You bring a school," he said. "Those children have been without a teacher for 2 years. Old Mrs. Fletcher did her best, but she passed last spring. You came in here, and in 6 weeks you had the schoolhouse running with real books and real lessons and 3 children who couldn't read learning their letters. You are not trouble. You are someone being followed by trouble. There is a significant difference." She looked down. Her hands, he noticed, were not quite steady in her lap. "Let me help you," Harrison said, and then, more quietly, "Please." The please did something to her defenses that the arguments had not quite managed. He watched her chin drop slightly, watched her press her lips together, watched her work very hard at not letting what she was feeling show on her face. She was not entirely successful. "All right," she said, barely above a whisper. "All right." He wired Santa Fe that afternoon. He also wired the county sheriff in Callaway County, Missouri, on the chance that anything new had surfaced in the 4 years since. Then he put on his hat and walked the length of Main Street until he found Warren Doyle sitting on the porch of the Frontier Hotel, smoking a thin cigar and watching the street with the patient, proprietary manner of a man who considered himself above being watched in return. Harrison stopped directly in front of him. "Mr. Vincent," he said pleasantly. Doyle looked at him with cool appraisal and said nothing. "I am Deputy Harrison Daly," Harrison said. "I try to make a point of introducing myself to visitors. Redemption Creek is a friendly town. We like to keep it that way." "I have no complaint with the town," Doyle said. "Good," Harrison said. "I would like to keep it that way. I would also like to be clear that this is a well-supervised town, Mr. Vincent. I take considerable interest in the welfare of all the people in it. Permanent residents especially." He held the man's gaze with a steadiness that he hoped communicated exactly what he intended it to communicate. "I hope you have a pleasant stay." He walked away without waiting for a response. The response came anyway, in the form of Crane. Harry had not known at that point that Doyle and Crane had a connection. It emerged later, in the piecing together of events, that Crane was a man Doyle had employed on 2 previous occasions, a hired instrument, functioning in the gray space between threat and action. What Doyle had sent Crane to do, precisely, was never entirely established, but the subsequent behavior made it clear enough. 3 days after Harrison's conversation on the hotel porch, Crane presented himself at the jailhouse with a fabricated story about a stolen horse, and while Harrison was at his desk taking down the report, Crane had somehow managed to get between Harrison and the door and produce a pistol, at which point the situation had deteriorated rapidly. Amelia had come in during the middle of it. She had not come in because of any plan or knowledge of what was happening. She had come in because she had baked a small quantity of corn bread at the rooming house. The landlady, Mrs. Pickett, had a generous kitchen, and she had been in the habit, for the past 2 weeks, of bringing a portion of whatever she baked to the jailhouse on the grounds that Harrison often forgot to eat properly when the sheriff was on his circuit ride, and he was the only one on duty. She had walked in on Crane holding Harrison at gunpoint. She had not hesitated or screamed. She had assessed the situation, identified the most immediately actionable thing available to her, which was the water pitcher on the small table near the door, and struck Crane hard across the back of the head with it. The blow had been sufficient to make him stagger and turn, but not sufficient to incapacitate him, and he had turned with the gun and had her in front of him before Harrison could close the distance. The rest had happened the way it had happened. The gun at her neck. The words that cut Harrison to the bone. His shot, precise and chosen, which clipped Crane's gun hand and ended the immediate crisis. Now he sat at his desk with Crane cuffed to the cell bars in the back room, and Amelia in the chair across from him, with a cut on her cheek being attended to by the application of a clean cloth, and a small bottle of carbolic solution that Harrison was handling with considerably more care than his expression suggested he was feeling. "You knew I was going to take the shot," he said, dabbing at the cut with a concentration that was partly medical and partly an attempt to keep himself from saying several other things in a less measured way. "You are a good shot," she said. "That is not an answer to what I said." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I knew. And yet you told me not to protect you, Harrison. You stood there with a gun at your neck and told me to let him leave with you." He set down the cloth and the bottle. He looked at her directly, and for once he let what he was feeling be visible on his face, all of it. The fear that had moved through him when she said those words, the anger that had followed, and underneath both of those, the thing he had not been putting words to for weeks. "Do you know what it cost me to hear you say that?" Her expression shifted. She looked at him with something unguarded and careful at once, like a creature that has been hurt so many times it does not entirely believe a hand extended toward it is safe. "I did not mean to cause you pain," she said. "I only meant that you should not risk yourself for my sake." "Why not?" he asked. She opened her mouth and closed it again. "Why should your life count for less than mine?" He pressed, not harshly but steadily, with the same quality of absolute conviction he brought to everything he believed in. "You came into that jailhouse and hit a man twice your size with a water pitcher to keep him from shooting me. You were not calculating the cost of that, were you? You just did it." "That is different," she said, but her voice had less certainty in it than it had a moment before. "How is it different? Because you—" She stopped, started again. "Because you matter." The words landed between them and expanded, filling the small room. "So do you," he said quietly. "Amelia, you matter considerably to those children at the school, to this town. He paused, making the choice with characteristic deliberateness. "To me, you matter to me." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the words traveling through her, encountering 4 years of carefully maintained walls, finding the places in those walls where the mortar had weakened without her knowing. "You do not know my whole story," she said finally. "I know enough," he said, "and I would like to know the rest, if you are willing to tell me." The evening was quiet around them. Somewhere in the cells, Crane muttered something unhappy. Outside, the wind moved through the high desert dark, carrying the smell of sage and cooling rock. Amelia Zane looked at Harrison daily, and she made a decision. The whole story took most of the evening. She told him things she had not said aloud to anyone. Not to the deputy in Dodge City, not to the town marshal in Amarillo, not to the women at any of the rooming houses where she had stayed in her years of moving. She told him about growing up in Callaway with Clara, 6 years her senior, who was the kind of warm and expansive presence that made every room she entered feel safer. She told him about Warren Doyle, who had been charming when he courted Clara and had changed, in the way that certain men change, slowly and then rapidly after the wedding. She told him about the visits she had made to Clara's house, the things she had observed, the conversations Clara had deflected or minimized. She told him about the last evening, the sound she had heard, the staircase, the cold horror of what she had found at the bottom of it. She told him about Doyle's face in the hours that followed, which had held a composure that she had found more terrifying than grief. Harrison listened with his full attention the entire time. He did not offer commentary or comfort or advice. He simply listened, which was exactly the right thing to do, and Amelia, who had learned to be suspicious of men who offered too quickly to fix what was wrong, recognized this and gave him more than she had planned to. When she finished, the room was quiet. "I am sorry," Harrison said. "About Clara?" Amelia nodded once, the precise nod of someone who has processed grief down to its most essential form. "And you have been carrying this alone for 4 years," he said. "There was no one else to carry it," she said. "There is now," he said simply, and she looked at him. And the expression on her face was the most complicated and the most real thing he had seen from her yet, hope and fear, and something that was not quite either, something that was almost an asking. The reply from the Santa Fe marshal's office arrived the next morning, and from Callaway County the morning after that. The news from Santa Fe was that Warren Doyle had an outstanding warrant from the Colorado Territory for fraud, sufficient grounds for Harrison to take him into custody. The news from Callaway County was more significant. A woman named Edith Pryor had come forward 3 months earlier with new testimony about Clara Doyle's death, testimony that corroborated and extended what Amelia had seen. And a Callaway County judge had issued a warrant for Warren Doyle's arrest on suspicion of murder. Harrison had Doyle in custody before noon. He wired both jurisdictions. He spent the afternoon writing careful, thorough documentation. He made sure Amelia was present when the official deputies from Santa Fe arrived 4 days later to transport Doyle north. And he made sure she saw the moment when Warren Doyle, who had been making her life a running nightmare for 4 years, was placed in irons and loaded into a transport wagon. Doyle looked at her as they brought him past. The look had menace in it, the automatic menace of a man who has used fear as a primary tool for so long that he deploys it without thinking. Amelia looked back at him with a steadiness that Harrison found, in that moment, overwhelming. She held Doyle's gaze until the wagon moved and the gaze was broken. Then she exhaled, and Harrison, standing 2 feet to her right, heard it, the long, slow release of 4 years of accumulated weight. He wanted very badly to take her hand. He did not, because the moment was hers and taking her hand would have made it about him. But she reached over without looking at him and took his. Her fingers were cold and tight, and they held on with a grip that told him everything she was not yet able to say. He stood there in the dusty street of Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, in November of 1883, with the transport wagon disappearing around the bend in the road and Amelia Zane's hand in his, and he thought that he was, in that particular moment, entirely content. The weeks that followed were the sweetest of Harrison's adult life, and he moved through them with the careful, slightly disbelieving gratitude of a man who has expected the floor to give way for long enough that he has forgotten what solid ground feels like. Amelia did not transform overnight. She was not, suddenly, an open and demonstrative person. 4 years of practiced self-protection do not dissolve in an afternoon, and Harrison did not want them to. He had come to understand that the watchfulness and the self-containment were not flaws in her, but the particular shape of her survival, and he found them as worthy of respect as every other thing about her. But she began, gradually and then with increasing ease, to let him in. She had supper with him twice a week at the eating house, no longer with a book open beside her plate. She brought him cornbread on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. He began walking her to the schoolhouse in the mornings when his patrol took him in that direction, which was every morning, though his patrol had not, previously, tended toward the north end of town where the schoolhouse stood. They talked about everything. She had read an astonishing number of books for a woman who had spent 4 years moving, and she had opinions about them that were sharp and precise and frequently surprising. He had read less but thought deeply about what he had read, and their conversations had the quality of two minds genuinely engaging, questioning, building on what the other had offered. He told her things he had not told other people. About his father, who had died when Harrison was 19 and left him with the dry goods store that he had sold to fund his way west, because he could not make himself stay in the place where everything reminded him of loss. About the year before he came to Redemption Creek, when he had worked briefly as a cattle drive hand and been comprehensively miserable, because he was not built for the rootless life. About the fact that being a deputy in a small town suited him exactly because he genuinely cared about each specific individual person in it, and a larger town would have diluted that. "That is why you were so angry," she said one evening, 3 weeks after Doyle's arrest. They were sitting on the bench outside the jailhouse in the cooling dark, as they had done from the beginning. "About what?" he asked. "When I told you I was not worth protecting," she said. It was the first time she had brought it up directly. "You care about each specific person." And I was dismissing myself as though I were not one of them. He turned to look at her. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." She was quiet, looking out at the desert. "I had been telling myself that for a long time," she said, "that I was too much trouble. That whoever helped me would pay a price for it. It was easier than the alternative." "What was the alternative?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and in the thin lamplight from the jailhouse window he could see the honesty on her face. "Believing that I was worth something to someone," she said, "and then losing them." "Like Clara," he said gently. "Like Clara," she agreed. He reached over, very slowly and deliberately, and took her hand the way she had taken his on the day they watched Doyle taken away. He laced his fingers through hers. He did not say anything, because he had learned that she received actions better than words when the emotional stakes were high. She looked down at their joined hands. She turned them slightly, examining the fact of them, as if committing the detail to memory. "I do not know how to be someone who lets herself be protected," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "You can learn. It might take time." "I have time," he said. And then, because it needed to be said clearly, "I have all the time in the world for you, Amelia. There is no deadline on this. I am not going anywhere, and I am not asking you to be anything other than exactly what you are. I just want to be here." The sound she made then was very small and not entirely controlled, and she turned her face away for a moment. And when she turned back, her eyes were bright, and her jaw was set with the particular determination of a woman who will not cry in front of someone and has almost lost the battle. "You are," she said, "without question, the best man I have ever met." "That is an extremely low bar in my experience of this territory," he said, and she laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in years. He kissed her for the first time that night, standing up from the bench to say good night, and she had turned to face him, and they had been so close, and the lamplight had been so warm, and he had looked at her with the question plain on his face, and she had answered it by stepping forward. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was brief and careful and entirely sincere, and when it ended she pressed her forehead lightly against his chin for a moment, and he put his arm around her and held her there, and the night poured its enormous silence over them, and everything was very still. December came with a cold that settled into the bones of the adobe buildings, and made the desert look stripped and honest. Amelia ordered more books for the school from the supplier in Albuquerque, and received a letter from the Callaway County Circuit Court informing her that her testimony would be required in person at Warren Doyle's trial in the spring, at which time the full charge of murder would be heard. She read the letter at the kitchen table of Mrs. Pickett's rooming house and felt the familiar fear move through her, and then she went and found Harrison and showed it to him, which was a new thing, the going and finding him, the showing, the not carrying it alone. He read the letter carefully. He looked up at her. "I will go with you," he said, as if this were simply an established fact that had been waiting for her to catch up to it. "The sheriff will need you here," she said, but she said it without the old finality, more like an attempt to be practical than a genuine objection. "The sheriff managed before I was here," Harrison said, "and we will time it for the quiet season. Late February or early March, the trail trouble is minimal and Earl can manage with Deputy Holt's help for 2 weeks. He set the letter down. "You are not going back to Callaway alone, Amelia. That is not a discussion." She looked at him for a moment with the precise expression of a woman who has spent 4 years being completely self-sufficient, encountering the genuine, uncomplicated willingness of someone to stand beside her, and finding that it did not feel diminishing but rather, unexpectedly, like breathing. "All right," she said. "Thank you." "Stop thanking me," he said, but he smiled when he said it. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a modest affair by the standards of larger towns, but it had its particular warmth. The church organized a service that the majority of the town attended regardless of their degree of religiosity, because it was warm inside and the choir was decent. The general store put up a few paper decorations. Mrs. Pickett made pies that she distributed to anyone she deemed insufficiently festive, which included Harrison. He gave Amelia a book he had ordered through the Territorial Book Merchant in Santa Fe, a collected volume of poetry that he had chosen not randomly, but because she had mentioned once, in passing, that she had loved poetry as a girl in Callaway before everything had made her too watchful for the luxury of it. He had written inside the cover, in his plain and careful hand, simply, "So you can have it back." She held the book for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at him with the full, undiluted force of what she was feeling, and it was considerable, and it made Harrison feel as if the air in the room had changed quality. "I got you something too," she said, and produced from the table a pair of gloves she had sewn herself from soft leather she had bought from the dry goods store, the stitching precise and even. She had embossed the cuffs with a simple pattern that he did not recognize, until she told him it was the outline of the bluffs east of Redemption Creek. "So you remember where home is," she said, and the word home came out slightly uncertain as if she were testing it, and he understood that she was saying it about herself as much as him. That Redemption Creek had become home to her, for the first time in 4 years, and that he was part of why. He put the gloves on immediately and wore them for the rest of the day. In January, a blizzard swept down from the north and locked the town in for 9 days, which was unusual for the territory, and created the kind of enforced communal proximity that tends to either strain or deepen relationships. For Harrison and Amelia, it deepened things. She spent more time at the jailhouse, since the schoolhouse was closed during the worst of the storm, and there was limited entertainment at Mrs. Pickett's, except for conversation with Mrs. Pickett herself, who was kind but relentless. They played cards at the jailhouse desk, a game called cribbage that her father had taught her, which she taught him with thorough patience. They talked for hours. She told him more about Clara, the good memories, the way Clara used to laugh, the way Clara had taught her to braid her hair the summer she was 8. Harrison told her about his brother Thomas, who was farming in Colorado now and was the most contented person Harrison had ever encountered, and about his sister Ruth, who had married a telegraph operator in Wichita and written letters that were full of such careful detail that reading them felt like being there. "You are very close with your family," Amelia said. "We were," he said. "Still are through letters mostly. I do not see them as often as I would like." "I envy that," she said, and it was not a bitter envy, just an honest one. "You could meet them," he said, and let the implication hang there, deliberate and unhurried. She looked at him steadily. "Is that an abstract possibility or a specific suggestion?" "Whichever you would like it to be," he said. "I am not rushing anything, Amelia. But I want you to know that I see a future with you, a clear one. When you are ready to think about that, I will be right here." She reached across the cribbage board and put her hand on his. "I am thinking about it," she said. "I have been thinking about it for a while." "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I do not know how much time I need," she said. I did not let myself think about this kind of thing. After Clara, after Doyle, it seemed dangerous." She paused, and something that was both fragile and determined moved through her expression. "But I find that I am no longer as afraid as I was. You have done that. I want you to know that." "You did that," he said firmly. "I just stayed close." She shook her head slightly. "No, the staying close was everything." February arrived, and with it came the last piece of the matter with Crane, who had been sitting in the Redemption Creek jail awaiting transfer to the territorial prison at Santa Fe. The transfer happened on a bright cold morning, and Amelia stood beside Harrison and watched that wagon leave too, and this time she did not reach for his hand, but he offered his arm and she took it, and they stood that way as the sound of the horses faded. "It is almost over," he said. "Almost," she agreed, and then, "Harrison." "Yes. I would like to go to the trial in Callaway with you," she said. "And I would like," she paused, and he could see her choosing her next words with the same careful deliberateness he recognized from his own approach to important things. "I would like, when we come back from Callaway, to begin thinking seriously about what comes next, for us." He turned to look at her fully. The winter light was sharp and clear on her face, and she was looking at him with an openness he had only glimpsed before and never seen sustained at this length. "I would like that very much," he said. They left for Callaway in the second week of March, traveling by stage to Albuquerque, then by rail on the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe line east, then by a connection north. It was the longest distance Amelia had traveled in 4 years toward something rather than away from it, and Harrison watched the difference in her as the miles accumulated, the gradual easing of the hunted look, replaced by something he could only describe as the expression of a woman reclaiming territory that had been taken from her. Callaway, Missouri was small and cold in early March, the fields along the road into town still brown and waiting. Amelia's face when they pulled into town was complicated, recognition and loss, and the particular grief of returning to a place where someone you loved used to live and doesn't anymore. Harrison put his hand over hers in the stage, and she gripped it and did not look away from the window. The trial lasted 4 days. Amelia testified on the second day, and she did it with a precision and a composure that clearly surprised everyone in the courtroom except Harrison, who was not surprised at all. She answered every question directly and without embellishment, and she endured Warren Doyle's stare from across the room with the same steady gaze she had given him in Redemption Creek when they took him away. And it was not that she felt nothing. Harrison could see from his seat behind her exactly what it cost her, but she did not let it move her from what she was there to do. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on the 4th afternoon. Amelia stood outside the courthouse in the pale Missouri sun and breathed, and Harrison stood beside her and said nothing for a while because no words were required, and he understood that. Then she said, "Clara, just the one word. Just the name." And Harrison put his arm around her shoulders, and she pressed her face against his coat, and he held her there in the cold March air outside the Callaway County Courthouse, while she finally allowed herself to grieve the thing she had been running from and fighting for 4 years. And her grief was private and deep, and not for anyone else's consumption. But he held her through all of it and did not let go. When it passed, she straightened and reached into her coat pocket for a handkerchief and composed herself with the efficiency of long practice. She looked out at the street, at the town that had dismissed what she had seen, that had allowed a guilty man to walk free for 4 years, and her expression held no bitterness, just a clear-eyed acknowledgment of what it had been and what it was now, and a readiness to stop letting it define the future. "Ready to go home?" Harrison asked. She looked at him and smiled. It was not her small, precise nod-acknowledgement smile. It was a real smile, full and unguarded, the kind that changed her whole face. "Yes," she said, "very much." They were married in July. It was not a large wedding. Redemption Creek was a small town, and neither of them wanted ceremony for its own sake, but they wanted the people they had come to belong to. The church was packed anyway, because it turned out that the townspeople of Redemption Creek had their own investment in the thing, had watched these 2 careful, serious people find their way to each other with the kind of community satisfaction that only small towns can produce, and they were not about to stay home for the conclusion of it. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Aldrich, who was a thin and enthusiastic man who had clearly been practicing for the occasion. Mrs. Pickett cried comprehensively and without apology in the second pew. The schoolchildren had made a paper banner that said "Congratulations, Miss Zane and Deputy Daly," and hung it at the back of the church, which Harrison noticed first, and which made him have to look at the ceiling for a moment to maintain his composure. Amelia wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored cotton, with small blue flowers she had embroidered along the cuffs and collar, and her dark hair was pinned up in a way Harrison had not seen before, with a few loose pieces framing her face. When she walked up the aisle on Sheriff Earl Combs's arm, the sheriff being the closest thing to a family figure they had available, and Earl being quietly, gruffly honored by the request, Harrison watched her come toward him and felt the entire accumulation of the past 8 months distill into a single moment of perfect clarity. She reached him, and Earl stepped back, and they stood facing each other in front of Reverend Aldrich and the packed church and the morning light coming through the church's single good window. And Harrison looked at her, and she looked at him, and the look exchanged between them was the kind that contains entire conversations. They said their vows in steady voices, both of them. Harrison's hands were not entirely steady when he put the ring on her finger, a thin gold band from the jeweler in Albuquerque that had arrived by stage 2 weeks earlier, but his voice was. Amelia's voice did not waver at all, which surprised nobody who knew her. But when Reverend Aldrich said the words that concluded the ceremony, she took Harrison's face in both hands and kissed him with a completeness that made Mrs. Pickett cry harder and made the assembled townspeople of Redemption Creek applaud with a warmth that rattled the church windows. They moved into the house on the east end of town that Harrison had been renting but never quite settled, and in the weeks following the wedding it became, with remarkable speed, an actual home. Amelia had an instinct for the specific small things that made a place feel inhabited and loved. A curtain here, a particular arrangement of books there, the way she placed a lamp where its light made the evenings feel warmer. Harrison had furniture and a working stove and the profound willingness to reorganize everything he owned to accommodate her preferences, which she found both touching and slightly amusing. "You moved the desk," she observed one morning, coming into the front room. "It is better by the window," he said. "You will have more light for the school planning." She looked at the desk, repositioned to receive the morning sun. She looked at him. "You moved the desk," she said again, with an entirely different emphasis, and he understood that she was not talking about the desk at all. "I told you," he said. "I have been making room for you since the day you arrived." She crossed the room and kissed him with a conviction that suggested she had no remaining doubts about any of it. The year turned, and then another. The school grew. Amelia got her books from Albuquerque regularly now and added 2 reading primers from a new press in Chicago. 3 more families had moved to Redemption Creek, bringing with them 4 more children of school age, and the former assay office was beginning to feel small for its purpose. Harrison had become, the previous spring, the town's acting sheriff when Earl Combs retired to his sister's place in Taos after 30 years of wearing a badge. The appointment was made official in the fall by the county commissioners, who had received, unbeknownst to Harrison, a petition signed by a substantial majority of Redemption Creek's adult population vouching for his character, competence, and specific value to the town. When Harrison found out about the petition, he had been genuinely speechless, which was unusual for him, and Amelia had stood in the corner of the room with a carefully neutral expression that convinced nobody. "You organized that," he said. "I merely drafted the initial language," she said. "The signatures were entirely voluntary. Amelia, you are very good at your job," she said. "People should be allowed to say so officially." In the spring of 1885, Amelia told Harrison she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, with the kind of quiet directness that was characteristic of her, handing him a cup of coffee and then sitting down across from him and saying it plainly. He set down the coffee and looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood up and came around the table and knelt next to her chair and held her hands and looked at her face, which was watching him with that particular combination of hope and careful reserve that he had spent nearly 2 years gently and persistently dismantling. "Are you happy?" she asked, and the question was genuine. She wanted to know, not for reassurance, but because she was still learning in the bone-deep way that his happiness was something she was entitled to contribute to. "I am beyond happy," he said. "How are you?" "Terrified," she admitted. "And wonderful. Both at once." "That sounds about right," he said, and brought her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, and she made a soft sound and leaned her forehead against the top of his head. Their son was born in October of 1885, on a Tuesday evening when the high desert wind was running long and cold outside, and the lamplight in the bedroom was warm, and Mrs. Pickett, who had appointed herself unofficial midwife and support person, had done so with the efficient authority of a woman who considers herself family. The doctor from the next town over had arrived in time, which was fortunate. And by 9 o'clock in the evening, Harrison was sitting on the edge of the bed with his wife and their son, who was red and extremely opinionated about his recent arrival. And the world had narrowed to the size of that room and was, within that size, entirely complete. They named him James, after Harrison's father. His middle name was Carl, which had been Amelia's father's name. James Daly turned out to be a large, determined, and remarkably cheerful child who spent his first 2 years making the absolute most of the fact that every adult in Redemption Creek considered themselves his personal guardian. Mrs. Pickett taught him to say please before he could walk reliably. The blacksmith, Mr. Orvino, let him sit on the fence and watch the forge with such regularity that for a period of time the child believed that all fire belonged exclusively to Mr. Orvino. Sheriff Harrison Daly's son was known by every shopkeeper and ranch hand and traveling merchant who came through town, and James responded to this universal familiarity with the sovereign grace of someone who has never had reason to doubt that the world is fundamentally benevolent. Harrison watched this, his son's ease and openness, and thought about what it meant that the person who had most helped make it possible was the same woman who had once sat across his jailhouse desk and told him she was not worth the complication. He told her this one evening, after James was asleep. They were sitting on the bench outside. Their bench, the jailhouse bench, which was still their place even though it was now the sheriff's office and not the jailhouse, because some things are what they are by accumulated meaning and not architecture. James has no idea what it is to feel unsafe, Harrison said. He will never have a reason to build walls the way you did. Amelia was quiet for a moment. I hope that is true, she said. It will be, he said. We will make sure of it. She leaned against his shoulder. 4 years ago I was sleeping in a rooming house in Amarillo, listening for footsteps in the corridor and planning my next departure, she said. I could not have imagined this. And now, he asked. Now, she said, I cannot imagine anything else. This is the only thing I can imagine wanting. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. Good, he said. The following year brought changes to Redemption Creek, as years in the growing territory always did. The railroad extended a spur line to within 12 miles of town, which meant the annual cattle drives that had given the town much of its purpose were shifting. The drives would go shorter distances now, feeding into the rail rather than walking all the way north, and the traffic through town changed in character. More merchants came, more settlers, more families. The school that had started in a 2-room former assay office was visibly insufficient, and the town council, of which Harrison was now a standing member by the common consent that seemed to operate in Redemption Creek as a substitute for formal elections, began discussing a proper schoolhouse. Amelia presented the case for the new building herself at the council meeting, with a written survey of the student population, projected growth based on the incoming families registered with the land office, and a detailed layout of what an adequate building would require. The council approved the funding within 20 minutes, which was the fastest decision they had collectively made on anything Harrison could remember. The new schoolhouse was built the following spring and was twice the size of the old one, with real glass windows on the south side and a wood stove large enough to make the room genuinely warm in winter. On the day the building was finished, and before the school term started, Amelia stood in the center of the empty room in the late afternoon light and turned in a slow circle, looking at it, and Harrison stood in the doorway and watched her. She had her hands pressed flat together at her lips, the way she held them when she was feeling something significant and containing it, and the light came through the south windows and lay across the new wooden floor and across her, and she was 30 years old and more fully herself than she had been at any point since Callaway. And Harrison thought, not for the first time, but with a freshness that the years did not seem to diminish, that she was the most remarkable person he had ever known. She turned and saw him in the doorway, and her expression opened up completely. "Come look," she said. He came and stood beside her and looked at the room, the clean bare walls, the windows, the rows of desks that had arrived the week before and were stacked against one wall waiting to be arranged. "You built this," he said. "The county funded it," she said. "Mr. Orvino did the actual building." "Amelia," he said with affectionate exasperation, "you know what I mean." She did know. She smiled, the full, unguarded smile that had become less rare over the years but had never stopped being something he was glad to see. "4 years ago, I had 17 students and a desk I needed help moving," she said. "You had 32 students last year," he said, "and this year you will have more. James will be one of them," she said, with a note in her voice that was equal parts pride and something tender. "James will be the most opinionated one of them," Harrison said. "He comes by that honestly," she said, giving him a look. "On his mother's side entirely," Harrison said, and she laughed and took his arm, and they stood in the new schoolroom in the late spring afternoon, and the territory stretched around them, red and gold and enormous, and the life they had made was solid and warm and real. The summer of 1887 brought a heat that settled over the territory like a hand and did not lift for 6 weeks. The river ran low enough to cross on foot, which it had not done in living memory, and the cattle on the ranches north of town grew lean and difficult. Harrison spent considerable time that summer mediating disputes between ranchers over water access, which was the kind of peacekeeping work he was, by now, genuinely expert at. The listening, the patient working out of competing valid needs, the firm and fair resolution. Amelia, in the heat, was expecting again. This second pregnancy was different from the first. She was less frightened and more impatient with the physical limitations, which Harrison found privately endearing and publicly treated with scrupulous solicitude. She continued teaching until 2 weeks before she was due, which her doctor considered inadvisable and which she considered the doctor's opinion to note and disregard. Their daughter was born on a September morning, which was somewhat cooler than August had been, and she arrived into the world with a quality of determined calm that she would retain for her entire life. They named her Clara after Amelia's sister, and the naming was not sad, or rather, it was sad and joyful at once, which is sometimes what it means to honor the dead properly, to carry their name forward into the good things. Clara Daly had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and she had from her earliest months a quality of focused attention that made adults feel, when she looked at them, that they were being genuinely considered. James, at age 2, was initially uncertain about the addition of a small, noisy person to his household, but came around rapidly when Clara, at 6 weeks, grabbed his finger and would not let go for nearly 5 minutes. He was, from that moment on, her self-appointed guardian, a role he undertook with the serene authority of someone who considers it simply obvious. In the evenings of that autumn, when both children were asleep, and the desert cooled, and the sky over Redemption Creek went its extraordinary deep blue, Harrison and Amelia sat on their bench and talked in the quiet way of two people who have made a long habit of speaking honestly to each other, and find the practice better rather than worse with time. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked her once, not with anxiety but with genuine curiosity. "Going somewhere larger, you could teach at a proper institution, a girls' academy even. With your training and your record, no," she said without hesitation. "Why not?" She considered this with the same care she brought to any question worth answering. "Because Redemption Creek is where I stopped running," she said. "It is where I found out that you can stop running, and the thing you were running from can actually be resolved. It is where James was born, and where Clara was born, and where you are the sheriff, and where I have a schoolhouse with proper glass windows." She paused. "It is home. It has been home for 4 years. I have no interest in leaving it." "Even when the summers are like this one?" he asked. "Especially then," she said. "The difficult things are part of it. You do not love a place only when it is convenient." He looked at her. "That is true of most things worth having," he said. She turned to look back at him, and the expression she wore was the one she had worn on the morning. She showed him the verdict letter from Callaway County the previous year, when Warren Doyle had been formally sentenced to 15 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. A kind of settled, forward-facing peace, without the shadow that had been present in it before. "You said I was not worth protecting," he said, and the old words were gentle in his mouth now, not painful, more like something they had kept as a memento of where they had started. "On the floor of the jailhouse with Crane's gun at your neck. You said it with absolute conviction." "I believed it," she said. "And now—" She was quiet for a moment, and the desert night poured its stars out above them with characteristic New Mexico extravagance. "Now I know it is not a question of worth," she said. "You protect the people you love, they protect you. It is not a calculation. It is just what you do." "Yes," he said. "It is exactly what you do." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed there in the good dark. The years that followed in Redemption Creek were good years, solid and full. The town grew, gradually but steadily, as the territory moved toward statehood, a long and complex process that Harrison followed with professional interest and Amelia with the particular attention she brought to anything that affected the institutions she had built her work within, since a change in territorial versus state governance had implications for how school funding worked, and she was not a woman who allowed implications to catch her by surprise. James started school and was, as predicted, extremely opinionated about everything, but in the productive way of a child who is genuinely curious rather than merely contrary. And his teacher, a young woman named Miss Hartley who had come from Albuquerque with excellent references, found him exhausting and brilliant in equal measure, and reported as much to Amelia with a directness that made them both laugh. "He gets the exhausting part from his father," Amelia said to Miss Hartley. And Harrison, who was standing 2 feet away, accepted this with the equanimity of a man who knows when his wife is right. Clara, when she started school 2 years after James, was Miss Hartley's acknowledged favorite, which Miss Hartley tried hard not to show and failed entirely. Clara read with an intensity that recalled her mother at the same age, and drew pictures that suggested she had opinions about how the world was arranged that she was not yet in possession of enough vocabulary to fully express. In the spring of 1890, Amelia organized the first of what would become an annual lending library from the schoolhouse, a collection of books available to any adult in Redemption Creek who wished to borrow them. The collection started at 60 volumes and doubled within the year as townspeople donated their own books to it. It was, Harrison thought, exactly the kind of thing she would do, the extending of the school's purpose beyond its walls, the making of knowledge accessible to people who had not had it. He told her so, and she said it was simply practical, and he told her that some of the most important things were simply practical, and she gave him the look she gave him when he said something she recognized as correct, but did not wish to reward excessively. He loved that look. He had loved it from approximately the 3rd time he saw it, which was during one of the early evening conversations outside the jailhouse, before they were anything to each other officially, and he had filed the love away as something he would examine later, and had subsequently done nothing with it for weeks, because he was constitutionally incapable of rushing anything that mattered. She had been worth the patience. She had been worth every slow, careful step of the approach. She had been worth every morning and evening and difficult day and easy one. He told her this one February evening. They were sitting in their kitchen, which was warm with the stove going and smelled of the coffee she had just made. And both children were in bed, and the night outside was the particular frozen clear that New Mexico territory produced in winter. The stars so sharp and close that they seemed more present than real. She listened to him say it with the full attention she always gave him, her hands around her cup, her eyes on his face. "I know," she said when he finished. "I know you feel that way." "I want to make sure you hear it," he said. "I hear it," she said. "I have been hearing it since the day you moved the desk to the window. I have been hearing it every day since." She paused. "You are extraordinary, Harrison. You are the most genuinely good person I have ever known, and I do not say that because you are my husband, though you are my husband, but because it is simply and demonstrably true." She set down her cup. "I did not know that people like you existed. I had decided that they probably did not." "People like me," he repeated, wanting to be sure he understood her. "People who stay," she said simply. "People who mean what they say and do not leave and do not tire of the work of," she paused, choosing the word with care, "of loving carefully." "It has not been work," he said. "It has been the best kind," she said. "The kind that feels like living." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned it to hold his properly. And the lamp burned between them, and the frost was outside the window, and the children were asleep in the rooms down the hall. And everything in Harrison Daly's life was, in this moment, and in the long accumulation of moments before it, exactly as it should be. Spring came again to Redemption Creek, as it always did, in the form of the river finding its conviction and the desert going briefly and brilliantly green before the heat reclaimed it. The bluffs to the east went amber and rose in the morning light. The children ran in the road after school. The lending library had a waiting list for two of its most popular titles. The new cattle pens near the rail connection were full and loud on Thursday afternoons. On his way back, he passed the schoolhouse, and through the window he could hear Amelia's voice, clear and measured and carrying the particular quality of focused engagement that meant she was explaining something she found genuinely interesting, which was most things. He paused in the street. Inside, 26 children were seated in rows facing the woman who had arrived in Redemption Creek 6.5 years ago with one carpetbag and no explanation, who had stood in a jailhouse with a gun at her neck, and told a man she loved not to risk himself for her because she had been told, by years of loss and fear and relentless pursuit, that she was not worth it. He could hear what she was teaching through the open window. It was geography, the shapes of the territories, the distances between places. Her voice was steady and alive with it. He stood there for another moment, listening to her teach, and the morning light was clean and warm on the red dust of the street, and somewhere back up the road Mrs. Pickett was hanging washing in her yard and singing to herself, and Redemption Creek went about its business in the good and ordinary way of a town that is functioning as it should. He walked home. She came in at midday, as she usually did on days when the school took a dinner break, and James was already there because he had run ahead, and Clara had stopped to talk to her friend at the corner of the street and would arrive shortly, and Harrison had made coffee, and there was bread from the baker on the counter, and Amelia came in through the door and stopped when she saw him standing at the stove and the kitchen warm and the coffee ready. She looked at him with an expression that was so complete and so without guard that it still, after everything, had the capacity to stop him briefly in whatever he was doing and simply hold still. "You are home early," she said. "I wanted to be here when you came in," he said. She set down her books on the table and came and stood next to him at the stove and leaned her head against his shoulder, briefly and warmly, the easy physical shorthand of two people who have had years of practice expressing affection in the everyday. "Good day?" he asked. "Very good," she said. "We did geography, and Daniel Foster finally grasped longitude, and you would have thought from his expression that he had been given a particularly wonderful gift." She paused. "Which in a sense he had been." "You gave it to him," Harrison said. "Knowledge is not mine to give," she said. "It is already everyone's. I just point at it." He looked at her. "You always do that," he said. "Do what? Give the credit elsewhere." She considered this the same way she considered everything, honestly and without reflexive deflection. "Perhaps," she said. "But in this case, I genuinely believe it." "Noted," he said. "You are still remarkable." Harrison stood at the edge of it and looked at his family. His wife and his children, this specific and irreplaceable collection of people in this kitchen in this town. And he felt, as he had felt on many similar ordinary evenings and mornings and afternoons, the quiet enormity of a life that had found its shape. He had not been sure for a long time what home was going to look like. He had known in a general way what he wanted, something lasting, something real, something with another person at the center of it who was worth the full weight of commitment. He had just not known where that person was or when they would arrive. And then a woman had stepped off the southbound stage from Santa Fe in October of 1883 and asked the proprietor of the general store if there was anyone who might help her move a desk. And Harrison Daly had been standing right there. The rest had been patience and care and the willingness to stay. She was standing at the kitchen table now, helping Clara out of her coat, saying something to her that made Clara laugh. And when she looked up and caught Harrison's eye across the room, her expression was the same one she had worn on the morning of the verdict, on the day of the wedding, on the evening in the cold kitchen when she told him he was extraordinary, that clear, settled, forward-facing look that contained everything that had happened and refused to be diminished by any of it. She smiled at him. He smiled back. Outside the window, Redemption Creek went about its business in the wide and brilliant afternoon, and the bluffs stood in their ancient red patience to the east, and the desert stretched south to the horizon, and the river ran with its spring conviction through the town's lower end, and everything in this corner of New Mexico territory was, in the way of good and earned things, simply and completely right.